Welcome to the Needless Things Creators Series, where we talk to creators about the things that they create. I'm your host, Dave West, and we're talking to John Kent of Toyfinity. John, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
So this is, in a way, this has been a very long time coming because I've been aware of Toyfinity forever, but as you can see behind me, kind of mass market stuff is usually my focus. But I've always had a love for independent toys. I've always liked to pick up a couple here and there when I can. Uh, and how I recently had to make the dive in is you offered a set of glow in the dark Mordles, and glow in the dark is one of my sweet spots for toys. And Mordles, so rocks and bugs and things, we got to talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to get to how did you get to where you are now? Because Toyfinity's been around for quite some time, unless I'm mistaken.
Since 2012.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Is you've been around for more than a decade, just almost just quietly releasing great product, which is unusual because in this day and age, it's all about the pre-product hype of like, hey, this is coming in like 2 years. Whereas it seems like your model is more, hey, here's some product, go buy it real quick. But I guess that really comes from you predating a lot of the business model that exists now.
Well, I'm not a big fan of the current pre-order system that the major companies have adopted.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a kind of change to everything in life. When I think the golden time of collecting for me was during the 90s. You had KB, Kmart, Toys R Us, some Kitty Cities in the earlier part. I talk to people from other states. I'm from the Philly, New Jersey area. And they're always telling me about places like Hills and something with the, hardware in the last part of the name that they would just buy their toys at. So,
well, we had Lionel Play World down here, which I'm in Georgia, which was, I think, a branch of Kitty City.
Yeah. Circus World. I mean, people
Yeah.
all have their favorites, and now we're to Target, Walmart, online. Or a great independent store. I mean, there are a lot of great independent stores I've been to throughout the country when I've been traveling for conventions and just for fun,
And that business seems to be thriving right now. And I appreciate the fact that those independent stores, a lot of the time, aren't just carrying retro stuff, but often they're a source for new independent toy lines. Like they'll actually order in the stuff that is sort of online only and have it in stock, and people can discover it in stores.
That's one of the great things that I see happening, where lines such as Animal Warriors of the Kingdom, all the boss fight stuff, Skeletron, Zombie Sailor with the retro WWF Hasbros, which I never thought would ever be a thing. But now there's like 5 competing companies doing it.
I against my better judgment, I just recently picked up this one of the newer guys whose initial releases were,
learning.
But now, he was learning. That's exactly right, dude. This Mark Marrow looks incredible. It looks like a Hasbro. Like he's nailed the formula. It looks great. And then zombie stuff. His most recent Cardona, I've got sitting right over there. Hadn't opened it up yet, but yeah, when I was younger in the 90s, when those figures were originally out, those Hasbro WWF figures, like I didn't have any interest in them because I was like, well, they look like cartoons. I never imagined that people 10 years younger than me who grew up with those as their wrestling figures, now they've got the disposable income. They're the sort of the primary collectors,
Mhm.
and that format is one of the biggest ones in independent toys.
That's one of the interesting things about the independent toy scene now is that you don't have the bottom line of a Hasbro and someone just has a dream and they say, I want 50 more Hasbro style wrestlers and Mitch from Grapplers and Gimmicks and, Zombie and Epic Toys, all those guys.
Yeah.
I have pictures on my Instagram of, I'm not all in
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
I don't need 3 Mark Miro variants, but I wound up buying 5 different British Bulldogs this year. So,
Well, they're only 10 on the market, so but they all look great. They they really look great, and that's I have developed now an affinity for that style of figure because while at the time I wasn't interested in it, uh, when I was older and going to Goodwill and finding big bags of toys was still a thing that happened pretty frequently. I got
mhm,
2 big gallon Ziploc bags of those Hasbro wrestlers, and I was like, you know what? These are really charming. I'm going to buy these. And they've been on my shelf for probably 20 years now. And so now I have a nostalgia for that I didn't have 10 years prior when they first came out.
yeah.
But it really is a fun form factor.
When you look at like the shelves behind you, I see tons of
Mhm.
Joe.
Yeah, yeah.
I love Joe. Um, I have the oldest. I have a Joe from the original '60s run, just one. I don't prefer that form factor on my own collections generally. Um, I have some of the '70s Super Joes, although they're in
Oh,
pieces,
yeah.
as you could imagine.
Oh, but I love them.
The designs are just insane,
Yeah.
insane to and people forget sometimes that Joe always leans into the super weird stuff after a while. I at one point had a complete run from 82 to 94 and then including all the vehicles and all of the Valor Venom era stuff through 25th.
Yeah.
I also have a pretty insane GI Joe Extreme collection.
Some would say that any amount of GI Joe Extreme is an insane collection.
And this is what I think the key to collecting is, right? That I don't like personally the 25th anniversary Joes and beyond.
Mhm.
There's something that when you move to the super articulation, it loses something for me for the trade-offs of more range in the arm, the way it looks to me.
Mhm.
Some of the newer figures are dead on. The Skeletron 25th style is, I think, perfected.
They've figured out the proportions in a way that I think Hasbro didn't until the very end of that 25th anniversary stuff.
Right. And boss fight, a lot of their
Oh,
figures,
yeah.
are just, but I don't like the ab crunch slash upper torso swivel compared to the O-ring.
Bizarre.
But that I understand why you would do that because making the O-ring figures is difficult
Mhm.
in a way that Hasbro makes it look easy because they released 550-ish figures that were perfect almost to a T.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the things you have to tell a factory to get your product the way you want is not always clear. That's what that's the one thing that when I look at social media discourse about
Oh, man.
how long this is taking for a project to realize that when you go to the factory and say, make me a GI Joe identical to this vintage GI Joe, if that's what you were going to do, let's say,
Mhm.
there's an X factor there about whatever went into the manufacturing of that, where every single time you're starting over from scratch, even if it's the same type of product, So just because they made Duke doesn't mean that the next figure in the series is going to be well made, because you could be within a 10% tolerance and one figure is awesome and the next one is not.
Yeah.
And anybody who's doing a Marvel Legends style figure independently, God bless you.
Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy.
I
When
wouldn't
you
want
see
to.
have you seen Zombies Jeff Jarrett that he shared the
Yes.
picture of?
Yes.
I can't even imagine with the way that he works, which I admire the fact that he's working towards product drops as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the pre-order system. But that Jarrett, when you compare that to a simple Hasbro figure that's essentially what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces on average,
Yeah.
compare that to the Jarrett that is, to my eyes, basically like a Super 7 Ultimate, which is many more pieces than that
Mm-hmm.
Hasbro figure. The leap between those two is wild. And the fact that any independent company, I've got this Cassie hack, and I'll tell you right now, I cannot remember off the top of my head who did it. It's not a perfect figure, but man, it sure is admirable, because I can't imagine the process of all of that from a factory, figuring out every bit of it.
Yeah. It helps if the factory already has some experience in making that style of figure. I remember I was part of the Micronauts group back in the mid 2000 to 2010.
Yeah.
And Palisades came to the group and said, "We're got the license to Micronauts and we want to make them, but the factory has requested mint samples from the original run."
Mhm.
So some of the group donated their mint on card samples to Palisades so that they could duplicate it exactly. And I don't want to say it didn't make a difference. There's something that if you from having tons of Joes, that if you use the wrong O-ring, the legs will twist at the waist.
Yeah.
Now, that's not an inherent flaw in the figure. That's an inherent flaw in the O-ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at some of the competitors, I never went deep into the core, right? Or American Defense and all these other
Yeah, right.
Joe-like figures. But some of them, I help local people I know who get collections in, sort their Joes sometimes. And you look at the figure and his hips just permanently go to the left or go to the right.
Yeah.
And when you look at the measurements of where the O-ring attaches to the J hook, it's like millimeters off, but it ruined the entire experience of what the figure's supposed to be. And that's, I think, the thing that it's hard for the fans to keep in mind, because Hasbro does it perfect most of the time.
Right.
And then an independent guy tries and his whole first wave is botched because the factory didn't understand something.
Well, and the other thing is that exact word is one that gets thrown around a lot, I think unfairly, is when people see a minor, I don't think flaw is even the right word. I
Mm-hmm.
think a minor aspect of the toy that isn't what you expected, and they call it a mistake or a botch, or, oh, this figure's messed up, or this isn't. Well, no, it isn't. It may not be exactly what the company intended, or it may not be exactly what you thought you wanted, but this is still and I'm looking at something on my desk right now, and I'm not going to pick it up and show it, because they're flawed figures, but they're fantastic. If you sit and put them side by side with
Mm-hmm.
vintage Joe O-rings, then yeah, you're going to look at it and be like, well, this isn't quite up to snuff. But if you take that vintage O-ring away and just look at this figure for what it is, it's an awesome toy. And I think
Right.
that's another problem too, is people doing too much comparison line to line. And I get it, because that's our natural instinct, is to want to relate things to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But like when I'm reviewing something, I generally really do my best to try and just look at it for what it is. And when you're comparing something independent to mass market retail, it can go either way, because sometimes mass market retail figures cannot achieve things that independently produced figures can, and vice versa. So you gotta take each thing for what it is, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. When you think about gummy weapons, air quotes,
Yeah, right.
they have safety testing, and the weapon gets run at what we would call durometer, how hard the plastic is. And their safety department probably says you can't make the gun this sharp. It's too sharp. And you run it in a lower durometer of plastic and it's floppy,
Right.
if it's really hot, and it's unfortunate that so much work went into it and you're let down by the manufacturing process to make it safe.
Yeah, that's been something and that's another thing with mass market retail stuff. The one of the biggest criticisms that they face tends to have to do with consistency.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you are dealing with something like the gummy weapons, now granted, I've got a number that are definitely like way softer than they should be, but in general, as long as something holds its shape, I don't need it to be the super rigid, like ABS feeling plastic. Like I'm good with a little flexibility, because look, if it's too rigid, parts are going to snap off, as we've
Right.
seen with plenty of different things. But the problem is the lack of consistency, because you've got everything from a rifle that you can just do that with and bend right in half, to one that if you try to do that, it is going to snap in half. And that I think is something they run into, where they're producing these massive quantities, many more figures, many more units per year than anybody else is dealing with, and they have to go.
Right.
And that's where we talk a lot about, on the GI Joe podcast that I host. We talk a lot about independent toy lines, and about how personally we want them to take their time and give us a good product.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these Kickstarters, you mentioned Skeletron, call sign Longbow, like all of these companies, of course they've taken a very long time versus what was initially hoped for. But I want good product.
Yeah.
Take your time, go through the process, go back and forth with the factory, and even your, I guess, more middle-sized companies like Super 7 have that same process, where they just have to go back and forth with the factory, and stuff just takes longer sometimes. And I would prefer that over, like I said, with Hasbro, they don't really have that option. They have so many specific goals they have to hit, that I would imagine it's very rare for Hasbro to go back and forth with the factory as many times as a smaller company might want to do it. But I also think it's more critical for that smaller company to get their product right.
Oh yeah. You might only get one try.
Yeah.
Were you reading Tomarts in the 90s?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember the hardcore?
Oh wow, that rings a bell, but no, I don't remember it, but it rings a bell.
So, are you familiar with a company called Drastic Plastic?
Yes.
They did some 12-inch military figures that might be controversial to own today, if you had them on your shelf.
Sure, I got you.
But in the 90s, he said, we're going to make collector grade 5-inch Toy Biz scale figures, and they're going to have real metal parts on them, and not be set to the safety standards, so you could have sharp whip blades and all different things.
Sure.
And through Tomarts, he had solicited this early bird kit for like 9 or 10 figures, right?
Okay.
And he took everybody's money, and then the letters started to roll into Tomarts saying, where's my figures? You've been promoting this. Why don't we have these figures? And he took on a project that I wouldn't want to take on that project now. 10 figures at one time is really, really a lot of work, even if you had a team, and you look at Boss Fight, and when the Horsemen did a Kickstarter, and Call Sign funded like 13 or 14 figures, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they had well, really, most of those O-ring Kickstarters have had relatively expansive first
Mhm.
offerings, but they have teams, to your point.
Right, right. But even with that team, it can still take years to
Oh,
fulfill
yeah.
because it's not one project, it's however many figures you funded project. And in Glios, when I make a new figure, it's 100% unique. So you're only focusing on that one figure. It
Right.
has to be compatible with every other figure, but it's not like you made that Spartan body for boss fight, and then here's Spartan 1 armor, Spartan 2 armor, space armor, the things that go on that body, where you can't develop the armor before you have the figure 100% because you need to know what it's going to be like at the end of the process so it fits proper.
Yeah.
Otherwise, who knows what you would turn up with.
Otherwise, you end up with things like backpacks that are not contoured to the figure's back.
I know you're referring to something specific, but I don't remember what it was.
Well, it's the one of my gripes with the classified series from Hasbro is
Mhm.
because I believe, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I believe that in some instances the accessories are developed separately from the figures, and the reason for that is you've got a lot of backpacks that are just flat. So when you
Right.
put them in the contoured back of an action figure, they just kind of hang and look really
Yeah.
awkward. And I'm sure it's by necessity. Whatever the reason is for that, I'm sure it's by necessity, but it is like, come on, guys, let's work together a little bit.
Well, being a long-term Joe fan, I went to the Joe Con from '02 through '07.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked what Fun Publications had done with those exclusive sets. So I
Yes.
always made sure I would go and pick them up and stuff. And getting to talk to the Hasbro guys at those shows, where somewhere in that Spy Troops, Valor, Venom era, they had contracted out the sculpting to overseas.
Oh,
And
wow. Okay.
if you remember Alley Viper 2,
Mm-hmm.
he's got legs. He's more leggy than Stacy Keebler. He's got legs that go up to his upper chest area, and then the smallest torso you've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And the fans, of course, online, monkey arms and all the insults you could imagine. But
Sure.
what they had done was moved away from that buck system, where in the 80s, if you ever get to look at any of the documents that some of the historians have turned up in the books that
Yeah.
some of the Joe guys have published, like
I've
that
got,
fantastic Carson's book.
well, and these are
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, Carson's book, the art of G.I. Joe, that's incredible.
The main thing that they did was made sure the figures were consistent. Like you said, the
Mm-hmm.
consistency was the most important thing. So a backpack had to fit on every single character, and every gun should be able to be held by every person, right? When I had read in one of those books or an interview online, there's so much data rolling around up here, it's hard to remember what the source was at this
Yeah,
point.
believe me, I can relate to that.
But if you saw it also, the Saw Viper's gun in the vintage line, 1990,
Mm-hmm.
they accidentally scaled it up like 125%.
Oh, see, I didn't know that. I know it's massive, but I
Yeah,
didn't know it was unintentionally massive.
right. Because it's a thumb breaker. If you
Yeah.
jam that into your Saw Viper's hands, you're going to break his thumbs off. And the gun's not supposed to be that big.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'll try to find the source and email to you afterwards. But it's like
That's great.
they really attempted, and that's why in the Valor Venom era, the new people that were in charge said, for ease of conversation, Tunnel Rat should be shorter than Duke, and Roadblock should be taller than Duke, right?
Mm-hmm.
Giving you scale. Like
Yeah,
Venomous
yeah.
Maximus is gigantic compared to the other guy.
Yes.
But then they don't. How do you make a 9 foot tall guy fit into a vamp, you know?
Right.
You can't have that consistency because something that we ran into when we were doing the world building for RoboForce and
Mhm.
Zeroids and the Manglers is like you have a mortal, and how big is the mortal supposed to be in real life versus how tall is the Mangler in real life? And if you look at the vintage RoboForce
Whoa.
comics, Max Steel in the cartoon is as tall as Mark Fury, right? So we went with Glyos scale, where the standard height of the figure, Faden, is I'm the worst with this measurement to real life stuff. So he's like 2.5 inches or close to 3 inches.
Right.
And that's how big would that be in real life? Well, they don't have humans, so there is no existing scale guide document like you'd have on a cartoon.
Right. There's nothing to relate it to.
Right. So you only know how big it is when you actually make a human figure, right? Now, Outer Spacemen had
Oh,
Glyos through the Four Horsemen, and there's a human in that. But when Matt did the Outer Spacemen in his line for Glyos, he said that they were giants. He showed the comic book, right? So like his character is small, and this thing is like the Prometheus engineer compared to a human, you know, gigantic,
right, right.
like a 13, 14 foot tall deity. And I prefer to think of it as the scale. It doesn't matter how big it is in human terms, right? When you have a Manglore next to one of my Zeroids, they're exactly as big as the toys are.
Okay, okay, that makes sense.
But when I want to do a comic book, I have to work with the artist, and he says, all right, how big is the doorway that these things are walking through? And I'm like, huh. Because I have Star Team, which has Zem, you know, the inspired by C3PO character.
Right, right.
And how tall is he compared to Knight of Darkness, who was inspired potentially by Darth Vader? Is it 6 foot and 5 foot? And then if you put a RoboForce or a Zeroid next to that, how tall are they compared to that?
Right, right.
So is a mortal as big as your foot? Is it as big as your lower leg? You know, and it's been made for some interesting conversations with the artists that I work with, you know, where we just have
So
to work it out.
that is interesting. And toy scales is definitely one of my points of interest because I when I talked to I can't remember if I sent you the link to it or not. When I talked to Brian Flynn, I brought up one of my
Mhm.
pet peeves, which is just the dumbest thing ever. It's a me thing, but it drives me nuts that we have all comfortably adopted saying things like 6-inch scale, 7-inch scale, because that's not a scale. That's a
Right.
size. It's not a
Right.
scale, but that's just where we are now, and I need to get over it. But so when I look at this guy, who
Mhm.
is one of the rocks from the original Rocks and Bugs and Things, sadly the only one I've got right now, because these are finding these in what I think of as display condition, which is not mint condition, but
Yeah.
display condition, for the right price is you got to be patient. But anyway, so this guy in my head would be like when I was a kid, I think I would have thought it was just this big. But now I'm more inclined to think that this is like a piece of landscape. Like this would be maybe up to 20 feet wide. Like this,
Yeah.
maybe, or maybe not that big. Maybe this is the right scale for a G.I. Joe figure. Like if a Joe is 6 feet tall, then this thing is, 8 feet tall or whatever. So Mordles going by that, or maybe like up to your knee
Yeah.
in my head. But that's kind of fun because it's really open to interpretation to anybody. Because as I said before, somebody else might look at this and think, well, no, it's just a rock. It's literally a rock that big. That's what it is. That so what how what went into making your determination of how big these were related to each other? Like, how did you decide, you know what, this is what I'm going with? Because that's a tough, realistically, to the consumer, it may just be, oh, this is a neat figure, cool. But as a creator, like, that's an important aspect.
Well, I think of it in two terms, right? In some classic video games, like Final Fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
you're a little guy or a team of people wandering across a giant map, right? And when you run into a monster, it goes into a different view, and then you're a bigger person fighting a giant monster. So, what I tried to do when we acquired the rights uh, was figure out what the intention was for all of these things to go together, because they're not naturally together, right?
Right, right.
Um, when I was presented with a list of the things from Ideal that the person I bought the rights from had access to, I looked over, it's like 70 pages long. And a lot of the stuff was board games. So obviously, I'm not going to, if I was on here and I said I own the rights to Don't Break the Ice and Mordles, you'd say, what?
Right, right.
Although I could see where that might go together. Don't let the Mordles fall through the ice.
I can see it right now, actually. Well, and these are, look, with the size that these are, you know what? I'm going to, real quick, I'm just going to bring up, because I've got a couple of slides to run through here, but here's a little closer look at the Mordles, just so everybody can see that these are 10 completely differently sculpted characters. You can see, from when I was holding it up earlier, they're a great little compact size. When you've got 10, they're a great little handful of fun. But these are, it's funny you say that, because to my mind, ready-made board game pieces.
We've
Like, I
thought
think
about
there's,
that.
I mean, it makes sense. And it would also justify, well, now I need a pink set. I need an orange set. I need you need multiple sets to get the game going.
It's the energy that goes into it.
Oh, yeah, right.
Hasbro, again, every quarter there's going to be a Marvel Legends wave, or 2 or 3, right?
Right,
And
right.
they have the machine running all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Where if I say right now, let's make Zem from Star Team, it might be, it's been as quick as a month. We developed the concept in a month. We were good to go. And then the sculpting begins, and then the talking to China about what it's going to cost, and then making sure the figure comes back, the test shots are good. So we've turned the figure around in like 5 months. Again, I have a figure that's going to debut soon that took 2 years of development time.
Well, and you bring up a really good point, because I think it's something that collectors sort of know, but maybe aren't fully consciously aware of, is when you decide you're going to make a figure, you just said, we can potentially get one out in 5 months, but that's not you pushing a button saying, give me this figure, and then 5 months later, China sends you a figure. That is 5 months of work and attention demanded from you. It is every step of the way. That is now part of your day-to-day life. It's not just hey, here's this drawing, make it.
No. And I'll finish with the previous question, and then I'll go into that.
Okay.
So you're familiar with Zeroids, the vintage ones?
No, actually, I'm not. I thought Zeroids was just part of because they're reminiscent of RoboForce to me. But no, I didn't even realize. Actually, I've got some. I got at least one picture. Oh, here we go. So no, I didn't.
That's my Zeroids.
Okay, what are the vintage Zeroids then?
Ideal was primarily a board game company. So they were great at board games, and what they would do is kind of copy a trend when they came to action figures.
Okay.
So in the 60s, Barbie comes out, right? Then Hasbro says, we want the male version of Barbie, and they make G.I. Joe.
Right.
Mattel says, I need a boys line, but I want it to be different than Joe in scale and concept. And they come up with Major Matt Mason.
Right.
They make a decision at that time to not do anything fantastic. It has to be all stuff that could really exist, assuming we could get to space, which we couldn't when they started the line.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no robots and there's no monsters, which leaves a hole for somebody to make robots. Ideal makes the Zeroids, which are in scale to Matt Mason.
Oh, wow.
And Color Forms, of all companies, says to Mel Burnkrant,
right,
make a line of aliens, which is the Color Forms aliens.
How do I know Outer Spacemen, but I don't know Zeroids? That's so wild.
Well, it's not the kind of common thing you run across at every toy show because of the vintage, mid 60s, fragile, kind of like a car of the time if you really chromed it out and made the robot and everything.
I have so I just pulled up a page. Well, I'll go ahead and share it here so the people watching can see this, because these are absolutely worth looking at. I've never seen these before, but just looking at them, I mean, they look like they are unlikely to survive 30 years or more.
It took me a long time to track down mint examples, but what you have to look at when you look at the scale, right? If you had a 60s Joe and a Matt Mason, how do those compare to each other? They don't, right? There's no G.I. Joe in Matt Mason's universe. If there was a G.I. Joe, he would be the same scale as Matt Mason and a totally different figure.
Because Matt Mason's were what, like 8? Were they 8 inches or 6 inches?
Like an 8. It's like an 8-inch.
8-ish. Yeah. Okay.
So if you can't play with them together unless you use your imagination, right? And ridiculously, in Matt Mason, Mattel had a 12-inch figure called Captain Laser. And the way they explained it, he's in scale to Joe. They said he's his friend from another universe or the outer space or another dimension or something.
Oh, wow.
So it's all about your imagination, because once they ran out of realistic space, Mattel's like, make us aliens, make us science fiction stuff, So then Scorpio comes and Callisto, his friend from Mars or Jupiter, I think. And it's basically a Matt Mason with a new head that's transparent green and futuristic weapons. So you have these universes that start to develop where, and this doesn't even count things from Marx with the old knights and cowboys and micro scale stuff like Fort Apache and the Navarone playset that, you have all those little guys with. So you have those branches of it's going to be 12-inch, it's going to be 8-inch, or it's going to be small, right?
Yeah.
And obviously the Matt Mason scale doesn't continue beyond the 60s. Joe does, right?
Yeah.
And Joe goes all throughout the 70s as that scale figure until we hit the oil crisis and need to scale down to Super Joe.
And then they go to that 8-inch size, though.
Exactly. But here's the interesting thing. When they license Joe to Takara, they try to put it out as a military man, and apparently Japanese kids didn't want a U.S. military man for some reason.
Sure.
And they take one last shot and they make him in clear and make him bionic, right? Predating $6 Million Man, Henshin Cyborg.
Yeah.
But 12-inch figures are too big for Japanese houses or something, and they scale it down to Microman, which then becomes Micronauts. And when Joe comes back in the 80s, they're like, it needs to be smaller. How big should it be? Oh, make it like a Micronaut, right? And this is why when we named the company originally Toyfinity, is that something happens and it creates the other branches, and then it winds up looping back into itself. So if you love superheroes, you can have 8-inch Mego superheroes. You can have 3 3/4 superheroes. You can have Marvel Legends scale. So many different scales. And it's all about how much you're being fed in those scales, where companies like Fresh Monkey Fiction have picked up the Secret War scale and done the public domain superheroes and Hack Slash and so many different things. And then somebody decides that superpowers is a form factor and makes new superpowers. O-ring is a form factor. Hasbro WWE is a factor.
Well, and this is one of the interesting things that I love about collecting, about the toy industry, about how these things feed into each other. So you brought up the superpowers style. So Fresh Monkey Fiction, let's see. Okay, wait. They had Amazing Heroes, which are the Secret Wars style ones,
Right.
and now they've got Long Box Heroes, which are superpower styled ones. But now you also have McFarlane doing their superpower styled figures because somebody there was like, well, wait a minute. They're doing that. We need to jump on that. And now you've got go into any Walmart and you've got a dozen different superpower style figures you can get. And good to go back to the Hasbro WWF style figures. Well, Mattel did those for a few years and then it died. And then Zombie and all these other independent companies started producing them. And Mattel was like, well, wait a minute. We want a piece of that action again. And now Mattel's making them again. Now, granted, Mattel, and I love Mattel. I think the guys who work in the wrestling division there work really, really hard to make collectors happy. But what Mattel's doing just cannot compare with what these independent guys are doing with that form factor. But I love what you just said, that it's all Toyfinity. It all feeds into each other. It all like this new burst of O-rings that we're experiencing right now, where we're seeing the best O-ring figures or the most creative O-ring figures that we've seen, since 1994. And the enthusiasm and the love that's going into them and the support for that part of the toy community. Like I just love that as much as people like have a tendency to say, oh, mass market retail, independent toy companies, blah, 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 but it really does all feed off of each other in the same way that, now every mass market figure you buy, a lot of independent ones too, come with just boatloads of accessories, which is not, in general, is not something I need in my life. However, toy photographers are such a huge part of the marketing push of any toy line. Well, you got to give those guys options. You got to get their exciting images up on Instagram. You got to give them reasons to buy your stuff and switch the heads and the guns and the hands and the everything else. I really think that that's a facet. So like, as much as we individually may not be into every aspect of it, everything's there for a reason. Every aspect of the toy industry exists because there's money there, because somebody somewhere has an interest in it. And I've always found that very fascinating. And again, I never thought about the name Toyfinity before, but you're right. It all just keeps going.
Yeah. And it will continue if somebody out there decides to make what would be the worst possible thing. I mean,
well, look, we're on the doorstep of the 30th anniversary of G.I. Joe Extreme. And all of those 90s, like Total Justice, like all of those posed 5 points of articulation, five-ish inch figures, we're right on the doorstep of that hitting the 30-year nostalgia mark.
Yeah.
I guarantee you we're going to start seeing some of that stuff within the next 5 years. Those extreme sculpts.
The terrifying thing is opening up social media and seeing a new announcement of something that I want, right?
Oh, you're right.
When Mondo said they were going to do the 90s aliens, I was like, well, better scoop out some cash for that one, because I think that might be my favorite 90s line.
I had the Kenner stuff, that Aliens and Predator line, which, by the way, you could spend nothing and have a massive collection, because they all, like KB, what was it, 3 for $10 when the snake alien and the cougar and like all the repaints that they did, like, cost nothing. You could have this amazing collection of beautifully sculpted, very functional toys.
Well, when it's easy for somebody to come along and think that, you're buying in as a collector, that you just had a bunch of money and you amassed a collection, right? But I've been scrapping along here since the 90s trying to get all these things. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, there were things in Tomarts that never got released, right?
Yeah, well, Tomart and not its successor, but and Toy Fair. Because I've got a Toy Fair collection that I can pick up literally any issue of Toy Fair magazine, and there's something in there that never came out.
Right. And Lee's
Yeah,
would
yeah,
always
yeah.
have, but obsessive compulsiveness leads
Uh-oh.
you to go down all these paths. So if you remember, the end of that Aliens line was called Hive Wars.
Yes.
And there was a character that they showed in Tomarts, but never got made,
Oh no.
called Smash Mason.
Okay.
He's the ultimate leader of the Marines. He
Of
looks like
course.
Schwarzenegger a little bit. He's like
Okay.
mega steroided out and everything. And I've been trying to get my hands on one of these things since it was in that magazine.
Right, because even if it's just a painted sample,
Right.
once you've got that picture out there, it exists somewhere, and probably at least 3 or 4
Right.
in some form exist.
So I got one this year.
Oh my gosh.
But it's that persistence, right? That
Yeah.
looking for the right thing. There were 2 aliens. There's a comic. You can go to like the Aliens wiki and find an unpublished comic that went with the Hive Wars. It has the
Okay.
Marine Predator in it and, the Hicks, but there were 2 more aliens. There was an egg alien where the egg would hatch and then fold onto its back. And then there was the dragonfly alien that would hatch out of an egg and the egg pieces would become wings.
Oh man.
Have those too.
Oh.
So it's like from G.I. Joe Extreme, the holy grail of G.I. Joe Extreme for the 5 people that love it is Mayday, the girl, right? And she was on the back of a package in the 90s.
Right.
So there were people trying to
Right.
track her down. And I not only have Mayday, I have that entire assortment that never came out. I have the assortment after that never got shown to the public. I have
Oh my
pieces from the
gosh.
assortment after that. And I have 2 waxes of yet another. One of the reasons it failed was they thought that G.I. Joe could be Batman and that
Sure.
you'd want Sergeant Stone in, hiking gear and Sergeant Stone with.
Yeah, right.
So people ignored what was actually happening with that line, which is the ultimate execution of Kenner reacting to McFarlane.
Mhm.
The detail in it is amazing. If it was called Rob Liefeld's Super Soldiers.
Yes. And that was the problem with the line is they slapped G.I. Joe on it.
Right.
Because people who didn't care about G.I. Joe but might have liked that aesthetic were not going to be into it. And people who love G.I. Joe were never going to be into it.
G.I. Joe and Transformers were in trouble at that point.
Yeah.
So they go to the Kenner guys who had success with Jurassic Park, success with Star Wars, success with all those movie-based lines. And they say, what do we do to turn this around? And they're 50-50. Beast Wars reinvigorates Transformers.
Yeah.
G.I. Joe Extreme buries it away for a couple of years.
Well, and it's funny because, you mentioned trying to do the same thing as Batman. And even with the Sergeant Savage line, to an extent, they did the same thing because we had like, I think 6 different variants of Sergeant Savage, which was half of the total figures released, I believe. Like it's that method doesn't work in that compressed a time with Joe.
Have you ever read the Toy Wars book?
No, I haven't.
Guy had unprecedented access to Kenner and maybe Hasbro during the 90s, right?
Okay.
And he wrote this book about it. So they had a group of kids come in and they showed them all the toys. There's a lot of psychological stuff that goes on with collecting that if you really do the deep dives, you can find what's actually going on, right? But they bring these kids in and they show them a G.I. Joe, a Batman, a Power Ranger, and all these other things. And the kids say, we like Batman the best. So then they do follow-up questionnaires with them and they say, why do you like Batman better? And one of the kids says, he's bigger than G.I. Joe. And that leads to years of them chasing a different thing overall.
Wow.
When what the kid doesn't know how to express, I don't want this military.
Right.
I'm not going to speak for all kids, right? The kid might have not wanted a military figure. He might not have wanted a small figure. He might have had some association with G.I. Joe. Or Batman is the biggest franchise of all time.
See, that was my thinking, is Batman is bigger as in everybody knows who Batman is. He's the coolest, not as in he's literally bigger than G.I. Joe. That's very interesting.
But you take this report back to the bosses and they say, make G.I. Joe bigger.
Bigger, right. Right.
Okay, we will. And then he won't fit in the vehicles, and you've made this an entirely different paradigm where you're selling a higher priced figure and the vehicles are lessened, right? Because you think in the late 90s is when figures become the important part and vehicles go away, mostly.
Yeah.
Unless your line is vehicles based, like Power Rangers. And the figures from the Power Rangers don't generally go in the vehicles. It's two separate toy lines that are called the same thing. Collect 5-inch Power Rangers.
That always blew my mind. Because when I was a kid, you were talking earlier about different toy lines and how in the world does the scale go together. And when I was a kid, I couldn't, and I knew kids that did this. I could not mix my G.I. Joes with my Masters of the Universe, with my Thundercats, I could not do it. I couldn't even mix G.I. Joe with, now, I did use Star Wars vehicles for G.I. Joe, but like the figures, just the 5 points of articulation versus the Joe art, I couldn't do it.
Right.
But to think about that meshing and how much more that intensified over the years of it really got to the point where it felt like each manufacturer demanded their own scale to an extent.
Well, you want it to be easily identifiable, right?
Right.
In the 80s, we could have on the shelves at the same time in some places, G.I. Joe from Flash, the Flash from Superpowers, a Flash Gordon figure, if those are still laying around in clearance, somewhere, because it wouldn't confuse grandma. It's two different things.
Yeah.
But then when it gets into global brand marketing, it becomes more important to protect every aspect of it. We can't have Optimus Prime and something else called Optimus out there. We have to protect that trademark so intensely. So when you look at how many lines would do a Power Rangers, where there's a micro scale playset that has figures in scale to the Zords, there's the 10-inch one, there's a 5-inch one, there's a Megazord system that'll cost you $500 to collect them all. And it knocks out a lot of the things that might have come out otherwise, right? Where in humanoids could have been G.I. Joe in humanoids.
Oh, I know. And when I was a kid, I didn't even realize that because I just wasn't thinking about the fact that their heads are so tiny, because in humanoids is my, that's my sweetheart line. I love them. I wasn't even thinking about the fact that the heads are G.I. Joe sized.
Yeah.
That they're G.I. Joes in giant suits of armor. My thought was, well, these just don't fit with G.I. Joes. And for some reason they have tiny heads.
But the thing about it is, and this is why Unit E was a thing from the 2010-ish era, where they were going to tie all the other Hasbro lines together.
Right.
If you fail with that, now you've destroyed 10 brands instead of one.
Yeah, and that's because we talk about this all the time. And granted, Skybound now with the Energon Universe stuff, where they're meshing G.I. Joe and Transformers, are, I think, tremendously successful. But like you said, with it, I've got the box set that they did right over here with G.I. Joe and ROM and everything else that they did. But at the time, you're 100% right. Transformers has been and will be Hasbro's reliable cash cow forever. But you're right, when you start tying other things to that and it doesn't work, Transformers alone cannot pull it up. It drags Transformers down potentially
Right.
if it doesn't work. And I
Exactly.
understand their trepidation around that.
The way my mind works, I have that entire IDW run.
Yeah.
I love that they just made the Micronauts came from Micronus Prime, and Mask is T-Cogs into human vehicles, and Energon. That's why their helmets were so fantastical. Energon.
Yes.
You know, I like the background linking of all that stuff. And that's a big part of Toyfinity, where some people would get a classic franchise. Not that I'm saying the ideal franchises are classics. They existed in the olden days. And there's ways to link them together. So to loop it back to what we were talking about, when you pulled up that image of the vintage Zeroids, right?
Yes.
That vintage Zeroid is, if Matt Mason is 6 feet tall, that robot is like 7 feet tall compared to him, which would go into what the thought of robot was at the time, like Robbie the robot. And
yeah, they're all big.
They're bigger than humans. You know, a 6-foot human is small compared to Robbie, right? And the robot from Lost in Space and all that stuff. So in the 70s, when a little company called Lucasfilm goes to all the toy companies, they show footage from a movie you've never heard of called Star Wars to Ideal, and Ideal says, nah, this isn't going to work, right? And the second Lucas leaves, or who his representative, they're like, we got to make a space line right now. Right this second. So what they figured out was take the Zeroid Zog from the 60s, and 1/3 of the cost was his elaborate head with the chrome and all the pieces that went into it.
Right.
Knock that head off and give him a dome like the robot we just saw in that footage, right? We have Captain Action's body laying around because they didn't get rid of tooling back then. Knock his head off and make a new head that's reminiscent somehow of that Darth Vader character we just saw. And they had, this is really ridiculous, a private detective in the 70s. He just passed away this year, called J.J. Arms. And he had both of his hands lost in an accident or something. So he had 2 hook hands, but he was a private investigator.
Oh, wow.
Ideal decides this is good product to make. And
good toy material.
They didn't succeed. So they take that body because it's smaller than Captain Action. And they couldn't use Action Boy because his articulation was not the same as a regular 12-inch figure.
Okay.
They go into the tooling and they sculpt mechanical detail into it. And that's where Zem comes from.
Wow, man.
So what you have is, this is why I was talking about the scale. Zog in the vintage line is an 8-foot tall or 7-foot tall robot to go with Matt Mason. You knock his head off, and now he's small compared to, I don't know off the top of my head. Captain Action's 12-inch, right? So Zem is like 8 inches, and now he's a 6-inch robot. But how big is he in real life? And they had Marvel do a comic that was included with all the figures. So you see it, and it's like this C-3PO that's more action-oriented running around with these 2 gigantic R2-D2s with guns. So the figure at one point was one scale, and then when they made him again, he's a different scale.
Well, and that seemed at the time, like in that era, well, really the 70s feel like wild times for toys because you got things like ROM that was huge, went with nothing, but it was just, it's a giant robot. And that it seems like there was sort of we're not so worried with how this might fit in with anything else. We just want to make something that looks maybe not even cool, but looks a certain way, has a certain aesthetic that we think is going to sell.
You know what I always thought of Ramlov after reading the legal briefs about him was that he's not an action figure. He's essentially a board game.
Oh, that makes sense, right?
Because not from our point of view. I mean, obviously he's a toy. He goes with 12-inch stuff.
Right. But the interactive elements.
There were 2 developers on it, and one guy would never sign off. That's why he never came back all those years. One guy said yes, and the other guy said no. So it was Rom's in limbo until when they do that comic with IDW.
Yeah.
And it's like what's that billiard game that the Parker brothers did? LEDs, like a little brown table.
Yeah, I can't think of what it's called. I know exactly what you're talking about, though.
Hot Shot or something. Like it's in that category of things where Rom's not your go to the store and buy what was Amigo, $3, $5?
Yeah, right.
Rom's like expensive compared to all the other stuff.
Because they're looking at it as an interactive electronic thing, not as this is going to fight your Shazam figure.
Which makes sense because they never made the dire wraiths, which are mentioned on the package, right?
Right.
They give you a story. They're like, here's what you're supposed to do. But is there a vintage ROM commercial? Is it a kid like in the G.I. Joe vintage commercials where they're playing in the mud? Or is it protect this electronic device with your life, because it's $80 or something.
Well, and that's what it was. If ROM was an action figure, there would have been a commercial with like kids outside and some kind of hut made of sticks or whatever, and ROM would bust through the sticks and like because there's nothing for ROM to interact with, so it would all have been environmental things like a pile of cups that ROM crushes or whatever the deal is.
So in the Toyfinity idea, where in the 60s they make the Zeroid, in the 70s they bring it back as Star Team and beat Lucas in court because it was not infringing. Star Team was a registered trademark from the 60s.
Right.
The thing that got them in trouble was the painting on the box, which has X-Wings.
That's great.
And
how easy would that have been to avoid?
If they agreed in the court case that if they made a second run, they had to change the paintings.
Wow.
But that was it.
That's tremendous.
Then what happens in the 80s is He-Man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ideal says, we need this He-Man money. So they start to develop something that will play along with He-Man. Yet again, it's not a super original thing that stands on its own. It's something that drifts off of an existing thing.
Yeah.
So RoboForce is actually supposed to come out in 1983.
Whoa. I never related those two at all.
Hold it next to a He-Man, right?
No, I'm picturing it right now, and it's
he could hug a He-Man, he could hug a G.I. Joe. He's a giant robot friend to menace or be friends with your other lines, right?
Yeah.
They get delayed by a year, and it comes out in 1984, which it's not going to work versus a Transformer. So that's it. But you had the same people who were like, we did robots in the 60s, we did robots in the 70s, we should do robots again. Toyfinity. It's
Little
all
did
the
they
same
know
links,
the greatest robots of all time were about to hit.
Mazinger? No.
Okay, you're not wrong. The most popular robots of all time, maybe.
I love them both.
Is a better way to say it.
And the same thing with horror, right? Where the quick story, because I know we're running into the time.
Well, I just want to be sure we get Toyfinity specific before we wrap up. But yeah, the horror, you've got my attention.
Mangler's, they came to Ken Kelly. He told me this story. We corresponded a few years ago before he passed. They came to him and they said, we want to make Universal Monsters Stretch Armstrongs, right? And he's like, well, what do you want me to do? And they're like, well, you could paint them and stuff. And he said, okay. And then they came back and they said, we can't get the rights to Universal Monsters. So can you make up a character in a day to justify this entire Stretch Armstrong type line, which is called Sorbothane? It's the stuff in the bottoms of your shoes, right?
Okay.
But it stretches if you put it in a figure form.
Mm-hmm.
It's not supposed to be ripped apart. It was supposed to be stretchy. So Ken goes home and he draws Swamp Thing. He just looked at an old comic and he drew Swamp Thing and took it in, and they were like, "This is the best. Can you make an entire line?" And he's like, "Sure." And then they've revised it to more of a primitive man than Swamp Thing. But you can see the original Swamp Thing one in the Ideal catalog from '83, I think.
Wow.
So the marketing department says you can rip it apart and put it back together, which you can't.
No, that is one of the all-time great it doesn't work action features.
So that, again, Ideal starts off with the idea. It's a Stretch Armstrong, and then they put something onto it conceptually. Rocks and Bugs and Things, same thing. They had an outside inventor who also is the inventor of Monstroid from He-Man.
Oh, wow.
This was a guy who, his name's on tons of patents, right? For mechanical type things. And they invented this squeeze bulb action feature and patented it. So they came in and they had the features, and then Ideal made up the characters, which is why it's kind of honestly half-assed.
Yeah.
They never could figure out a better name than Rocks and Bugs.
It is the worst. I love the line and I love the concept, but yeah, the name is the worst.
The Mordles weren't even part of it originally.
Well, and see, that's the funny thing about, and that brings us kind of all the way back around to Toyfinity. I was aware of the Toyfinity Mordles. So were those the first thing that you launched?
Yes.
So I was aware of those very soon within their launch because they're little monsters. They look cool to me. I had no recollection whatsoever that I thought they were an original IP. I did not remember that they were part of the Rocks and Bugs and Things line. As a matter of fact, for years, really, I only had a vague recollection of Rocks and Bugs and Things because I was that 85? Okay, so I was about 9. I was old enough to pretty much remember them pretty well, but they didn't last very long. I never had any. So like I remembered it was a thing, but it wasn't anything that I focused on. So I had zero recollection of the Mordles being part of that. I just knew when you first started offering them, I was like, look at these cool little guys. I like this. But then just didn't. I'm always constantly in this flux of I love the creativity and how interesting independent toy lines are, but I need my Batmans.
Right.
Like that's always my struggle. So to realize at one point that the Mordles were tied to that line that I have such an affection for, because like I would count Rocks and Bugs and Things among the 80s gross out toys. Mm-hmm. Like I think they're part of that lineage, and I have such a soft spot for Mad Balls and Boglins and all that kind of stuff. So to find out these were part of that, I was like, well, I must own some. But how did you land on that as like, this is the thing I have to make?
I was developing my own Glyos line. You know, Glyos was made up by Matt Dowdy of O'Neill Design, and it came to market in 2007. So I had been in since the second wave of Glyos. And
now, first, what was the initial Glyos offer? Was it just called O'Neill Designs Glyos? Like what the initial offerings were just, because I feel like maybe they were offered in from Diamond or something. Like you could, when you got your previews, you could maybe go in and no.
They were advertised in Lee's.
Okay.
And they would have had an article in the final issue of Toy Fair, the one that went online only.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Oh.
But it was just direct from O'Neill and at conventions and stuff. So, you know, he was developing this line, and he had these characters. He has a universe of characters in his mind, and he's just slowly been rolling it out as demand and time and money has allowed. So
sure.
He started off with 2 figures, Phaedon and Exilus, original characters of his own design, and sold those for a couple of years, then introduced some of the other characters like Buildman. And one of his main ideas was you have a figure that is the regular colors, like a black suit Batman, let's say.
Right.
But you really wish that you could put the red arms and legs on them,
Uh-huh.
right? Like Kenner would do. Kenner, how many variants of they've done the entire Pantone book of Batmans, right?
Yeah, right.
But what if you could customize it the way you would want it? So his upper arm could be blue and he'd have a black glove and a white chest, whatever your mind said it wanted to be.
Well, and also it's just play value.
Yeah.
It's just fun. I got obsessed with Outer Spacemen for a little while. The most recent iteration of them.
Yes.
I actually had, and I'm blanking on his name now. The lawyer that currently,
Gary. Yeah.
Gary. Thank you. I had my old podcast, which was also Needless Things, but was just audio. I had him on. He was absolutely fantastic. But I got obsessed with Outer Spacemen to the point where I was just, I was getting every release that I could. They did all the different colorways. And it's so much fun to sit down at like a card table, take everything apart, put it all back together, make different. It's that play value, and that's one of the reasons why I think Masters of the Universe Origins was so successful initially, is because they adopted that swappable parts that Glyos has really made. I don't want to say an industry standard, but something that has become a thing in the industry. So his vision was, I understand that people want to fiddle with things, basically.
Yeah, that's one part. And it's also having vision, right? Where what really makes, this was one thing I liked in 25th Joe. Duke is wearing a dress shirt and Flint's wearing a dress shirt, right?
Right.
Do they have two different brands of dress shirt?
Right.
It's the same shirt.
Yeah.
It should be the same shirt, right? And what you're really doing is you're overlaying the Duke pieces of the design or the Flint pieces of the design on the same shirt.
Right.
Which
the
will
web
give
gear
you,
or whatever.
Right. Two characters for one tooling. And in Glyos, he has characters that are the Faden head with the robot chest.
Yeah.
And the arms of another thing. If you followed Glyos, he remixed the Mangler's parts into his own characters. So the Kaidrathi are like the children of an elder god, and the arms and legs that you see on that Mangler, they're part of his character, but the feet are different, like the spacesuit feet. So
Yeah,
painted different, and it has new heads. Because how much different is dress shirt A going to be from dress shirt B?
Well, and that's another thing that I've particularly with modern toy lines. Now, granted, in the 80s with Masters of the Universe, so many shared parts that are just painted different colors, have different heads on them, whatever the case. I love the idea of shared parts. I love seeing, just recently, we mentioned Fresh Monkey Fiction earlier, their new line, Operation Monster Force, where they've taken essentially the troop builders are all the same parts. They're just painted differently. They have different head options. And it really is almost an extension of the idea of Glyos, where we have this basic system with endless customization to it. And that's fascinating to me.
So that's where when you start after the Mordles were easy because we just took the vintage ones, took the CBS copyright info off and made them again because people didn't have them, right?
Right.
Then we developed RoboForce. And what we did was we used a designer toy idea, right? In case anything ever happened with the rights, because rights from the 80s are so legally complicated sometimes.
Yeah.
There was a potential of someone showing up and saying, I own RoboForce. And we also thought maybe RoboForce had the most potential to be sold off at a later time, which it did turn out to be. And so what we did was...
Bizarrely, you can walk into a Walmart and buy a RoboForce figure right now.
Yes, that was my hope.
Nobody saw that coming.
I knew it was going to happen. So, I mean, I'm glad that they executed that. That's part of what I wanted. Max was too good to just be left in the trash bin of history for no reason other than Transformers came out the same year. So what we did was we designed a kind of original robot and then made Max steel pieces to go onto it. So the majority of the robot, which we still sell, is not Max Steel, not RoboForce. You can see it in the Zero drone. That was Max,
Right.
but now it's not,
Yeah.
because the arm tubes are arm tubes.
Yeah.
The treads are, in addition, there was no treads, and that's from Zeroids, actually. And since we had the Zeroids rights from the beginning, I was like, we have to change this up and give them treads, because eventually when we introduce the Zeroids, we'll already have the treads. So you have to have this fourth dimensional thinking when you do Glyos, right? The Zeroid that you see in that picture, Zintar, shares pieces with the mini Zeroid, but shares no pieces with the Zero drone. But you can mix them together, and we did when we, in RoboForce, the legendary big bad of the line was called Nazgar. Basically a brain on like a 12-foot tall mechanical body. What Matt did was we developed the Zeroid second, and he made it so you could make it into Nazgar.
Oh, nice.
But we also knew we wanted to make Night of Darkness, right? From Star Team. Because I saw this vision of, you have these lines that if you do them separately, they're not going to survive again, right?
And to go back, Night of Darkness is the Darth Vader-ish character. Okay.
He's actually, his mask is more like Phantom of the Paradise, which even amuses me more.
Oh, wow.
Like an owl-faced mask.
Yeah.
And what we wanted to do was link all the things together without stepping on the original continuities, right? They were so vague that you could link them together, because in Nazgar's story, they said that he had been dead for 1,000 years and came back. Well, what if 1,000 years ago he had fought the Zeroids?
Sure. Yeah.
And that the Zeroids were from planet Zero, and that the planet in RoboForce is Zeton. So I was like, it's the same planet. They just renamed it because something happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Star Team is what happens in the middle, where they explore the universe,
I love that.
And somewhere in the universe is this planet of monsters that become the Manglors. And the rocks and bugs and things are just special Manglors.
Ah, that's fantastic. I love that exploration of sort of headcanon into logic, into how can these things all work together. And actually, speaking of working together, for anybody watching this that doesn't know, what this Glyos system means is that the arms, the legs, the heads of all of these figures all have the same. Okay, so it's a post and a hole, but is there a specific term for those?
We usually just say pins and ports. So
pins and ports. Okay.
But it's all QC'd by Matt. So you can't, it depends on the project. For Outer Spacemen, you have that interchangeability, but they're not meant to build, right?
Yeah.
The RoboForce kit, now the Zeroid, is actually 5 different figures. But the figures don't all make, the molds don't all make a figure.
Right.
So the arms are a mold, right? Because somebody else in the Glyos universe, the creators in the Glyos system, Spy Monkey or Warlords of War or the God Beast, they might need robot arms, right?
Right.
Well, in the same way that when we develop the arms, they're not specifically Max Steel arms. It's Robbie the Robot flexi arms, right?
Yeah.
Well, why should the God Beast tool up a brand new set of arms if he only needs to run them one time? Now, he made a bug guy. One of my lines is called Rocks and Bugs, right? So if we make an insectoid character who fits in and those pieces are usable, then it kind of, depending on our relationships together, of course.
Yeah.
But you can link it all together or not link it together.
Yeah.
Where I like the linking. In my mind, all of the other Glyos creators, their figures exist in the infinite worlds of toys, right?
Yeah.
But they don't exist in my universe unless I introduce them in. But this is where we get into that scale question. So the gravel guts that you showed earlier, right,
Uh-huh.
exist in two forms in my mind, in my universe. There's one of those that if you put it next to my existing Manglord, would be that exact scale. He's a Goliath monster, right? And the creature that you see inside that rock in my mind is a character that we might make someday. The
Okay.
Manglo troll. So he'd be big. He'd be like a Toy Biz scale figure, right?
Okay.
But also on Earth, not in my universe, the Mordles go through time and space through a portal and they're on Earth. So they're as small as they would be if you put them out in your garden, like you said.
Yeah,
Where if you
yeah.
put that gravel guts out there, that's exactly how big he is compared to you.
Oh, it's great. I love that. I love hearing thought processes of toy creators because and it was interesting because like if you watch any of the Hasbro live streams where Lenny, the guy who's running Classified now, he'll sort of run through the way that he thought about the process of designing a figure. I love that kind of stuff because it's important, I think, for collectors to know that it's more than just, I think this will look cool. I love that creators are building universes, are conscious of how these things might interact with each other, are conscious of how they're going to look on the shelf together. Like I that kind of stuff is fascinating.
One of my picture series that I do, not to the public, but to Matt, I'll send Matt a text and it's the Manglord. He's made the Manglord, Matt designed that new Manglord.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did was we didn't want him to be a naked green He-Man.
Right.
Because if somebody ever does a vintage style line, like a reaction line, say I license that to Super 7, they're going to want to do the vintage one.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have personal interest in naked green He-Man. I said, make it the way it should be. Because he's been thinking about this since the 80s too. If you ever meet Matt, his brain is full of everything. And he said that the Manglord would evolve over years into an armored form to better fight, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And the PVC connections are so strong. So I'll take a picture of him power bombing everything. I have pictures on my phone of him. He can actually hit the full weight of a deluxe class Transformer.
Oh my gosh.
Not for hours or anything.
Sure. But long enough to take a picture is still pretty impressive.
He-Man Origins, they've all gotten suplexes and, that's the interaction that I think about when I do it. And the claw arm can hold full scale figures, and hold them over their heads.
Oh my gosh, that's wild.
But we wanted to, because I love Joe, right? The thing I was developing before I got the rights to all these lines was like a space G.I. Joe with a bioorganic cyborg dog that would turn into his weapons.
Oh, I love it.
So we were going to do an original line, right? And there was a robot involved and there was a character that was like half snake, half person. But I missed an auction for an unproduced RoboForce figure called Tiltor. My save searches went into spam and I didn't see it. So I started Googling obsessively and I found somebody who had scanned in the blueprints for Tiltor, the original blueprints for my deal.
Oh, wow.
And I emailed him and I said, how do you have these blueprints? And he said, I got them from the guy who owns Ideal now. So I went to the guy and I said, do you have the rights to Rocks and Bugs and things? He's like, take a look at this document and tell me what you're interested in. And that's how the whole ball got rolling.
Wow.
Gosh, this guy, amazing. I'll hit this real fast. He figured out that you put thousands of dollars of development into a board game like the Jaws board game from the 70s, right?
Yeah.
How long is the movie going to be out? A year, 2 years? Then it goes into a warehouse somewhere. But they only sold that game in the United States, according to what he had said to me. So he would take the mold, make it, put it in Spanish language packaging and sell it down in Mexico.
Yeah.
And his development costs were a translation into another language. So he would buy all these rights to things from other companies that were done with them. He owned the molds to the Darth Vader carry case.
What?
Because Kenner was like, we're never going to make Star Wars again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And then 10 years later, they're like, "Do you still have that mold?" And he's like, "Yeah, I do."
Wow.
For however many, whatever his profit
Yeah.
was on
Yeah.
that. But that idea of it still has value just somewhere else. So when I was in the 2000s and I went to a Family Dollar and saw a game called Sharky's Diner, and I'm like, this looks like the Jaws game, and it was the
It
Jaws game.
was the Jaws game. Yeah. I had some level of awareness that that was more than just the Jaws game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Well, this has literally been one of the best conversations about toys I have ever had. I appreciate it. Where can we find you online? Are you on socials at all?
Yes.
Where can we follow you on, Instagram or X or whatever?
The most active one is probably the Instagram, and it's under should have this pulled up, right? It is actually under Toyfinity there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that I tend to prefer Instagram as well. It seems like the easiest and most direct communication out of all of them. But I highly recommend everybody visit toyfinity.store. Pick something out. Find one thing that looks cool to you. Order it. Play around with it, and then you're going to order more things, and you're going to build robots, and you're going to have Manglores, and you're going to have a blast with. I think what delights me the most is that these are toys.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they're collectible, but they're also playable, as we talked about with the swappable parts. Like they're just fun to play with, and that in this day and age, while I love my collector-oriented stuff, I love getting my hands on just a good toy too.
Same.
Well, man, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. I would absolutely love to have another conversation sometime because I feel like we barely scratched the surface of not just Toyfinity, but really just toy history. I'd love to talk again.
Everything. Yeah, definitely good. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks a lot, man.
All right.
Smash that like button if you like Needless Things.